I'd like you to meet a genius. This man is one of Jamaica's foremost record producer. He has produced such artists as Junior Marvin, The Meditation, The Upsetters, to name a few. He's not only a record producer, he's a songwriter, a poet, a musician, a video expert, and overall a Rasta man. The man I'm talking about is none other than Lee Scratch Perry, better known in Jamaica as the Upsetter. Crucial.
Rainford Hugh Perry, better known as Lee Scratch Perry, was born on March 20th, 1936, in the small town of Kendal in the parish of Hanover in the northwest of Jamaica. After leaving school at 15, he got a job driving a tractor for the construction of the first road to the nearby seaside town of Negril, later to be one of the top tourist destinations on the island. It was here in Negril that he had the epiphany that put him on the path to being one of the most influential and groundbreaking record producers of all time.
If I was not in Negril, I wouldn't be a top producer. Because it's when I was working with the rock, I pick up those sonic vibration, and I hear the rock. When you throw the rock, it sounds just like you hear the thunder roll on that thing. I'm sure that's where everything coming from. So I hear in those sounds and the clash, and like the drum, and then when I hear when the cymbal hit, and I hear the rain, and I hear when the stone clash, and I hear the thunder roll, and I hear the lightning flash. That's why I come to get involved in the music business. I learn everything from stone.
With his newfound ambition to break into the music industry, Lee Perry set off for the capital, Kingston. He got his start in the music business with Cox and Dodd, working at his recently established Studio One facility. At first he just did odd jobs, but eventually worked his way up to record seller, and before too long he was running sessions recording some of the many Studio One artists. He also began recording his own songs. It was from one of these songs, Chicken Scratch, that Lee Perry got his nickname, Scratch. Lee Perry recorded more than 30 songs for Cox and Dodd before personal and financial disagreements ended their working relationship. As a parting shot, he recorded and released the song I Am the Upsetter, an early example of a diss track, with the lyrics accusing Dodd of greed, envy and exploitation.
I am the upsetter.
Perry teamed up with Joe Gibbs in 1966 and began recording tracks on the 2-track tape machine at the back of Gibbs' TV repair shop. Once again, financial disagreements led to Perry moving on in 1968. This time he set up his own label, Upsetter Records, taking the name from the track aimed at Cox and Dodd. The first breakout single from the new label was People Funny Boy, once again a diss track aimed at his previous employer, this time Joe Gibbs. To further poke fun at Gibbs, Perry added the sound of a baby crying over the intro to the song. This is one of the earliest examples of sampling in contemporary music. The single sold more than 50,000 copies in Jamaica alone, increasing Perry's fame in Jamaica and giving him the money to invest in his music. Joe Gibbs released People Grudgeful in response to People Funny Boy, making the two songs possibly the first ever on-record feud. Lee Perry put together a band for his new label, The Upsetters, led by pianist Gladstone Anderson. The Upsetters recorded and released a series of singles throughout 1968, and in 1969 they released their breakout hit, Return of Django. It was released on UK reggae label Trojan Records in September and entered the UK charts at number 50. By November the 2nd, it had climbed to number 5, peaking at the same spot held by David Bowie's Space Oddity the previous week. With a single in the top 10, a tour of the UK was inevitable. However, Gladdy Anderson and the rest of the original Upsetters lineup were unavailable, so Perry drafted in newly formed group the Hippie Boys to replace them on the tour. The rhythm section of the new lineup was brothers Carlton and Aston Barrett. After returning from the UK, Lee Perry was approached by Bob Marley, who asked him to produce their next album. Marley wanted to break out of the Jamaican music scene and felt Perry, with his newfound success in Britain, was the man to help him do it. Until this point, Bob had never really expressed his Rasta beliefs on record, and the songs he wrote were mostly love songs. Lee Perry encouraged Bob to start including everything into his music. The sessions with Lee Perry began in August 1970 at Randy's Studio 17 in Kingston, as Perry didn't have his own studio yet. The first song the Wailers and Lee Perry worked on together was Soul Rebel. The sound of the recording was different from previous Wailers tracks. The recordings for Cox and Dodd featured the Studio One house band, the Soul Brothers. That was made up of ex-Scatterlight members following the breakup, and as a result featured a trademark of the Scatterlights, horns. The Lee Perry recordings featured his Upsetters band, including Carlton and Aston Barrett, who would later become the backbone of the Wailers backing band. Gone were the horns and the other frills, and instead the recordings were stripped back to just drums, bass, guitar and organ, allowing much more space for Bob, Peter and Bunny's vocals. The ska rhythms had been slowed down to the new rocksteady style that was gaining popularity, and the bass was a more prominent feature. The Wailers recorded with Lee Scratch Perry for 4 months, and many consider those tracks to be among the best Bob Marley recordings. Perry's pioneering recording techniques combined with Marley's songwriting seemed like the perfect match. Both Bob Marley and the Wailers and Lee Scratch Perry had their own record labels at this time. The Wailers had Wayland Solemn Records, and Perry had Upsetter Records. But it seems they hadn't fully discussed who was going to put out this album. Without consulting Marley and the other Wailers, Lee Perry licensed the album to Trojan in the UK. The album was released in December 1970, and the members of the band don't even appear on the cover. Lee Perry licensing the album to Trojan without Bob Marley's knowledge caused them to fall out. He managed to make another album, Soul Revolution, out of the Soul Rebel sessions, a combination of leftovers, alternate versions, and songs that would later be re-recorded and released by Island on future Bob Marley albums. Perry would later produce other Bob Marley songs, such as Punky Reggae Party, but this would be the only time they got together to make an entire album. Despite that, it remains a crucial release in the evolution of reggae music, and a pivotal moment for the Wailers. They found a new direction and redefined themselves as rebel music, and with the addition of Carlton and Aston Barrett, they now had the lineup that would propel them beyond the Jamaican music scene. After Soul Rebels, Perry continued to release albums with his band The Upsetters, each of them released on labels in the UK, further growing Lee Perry's audience outside of Jamaica. In 1973, Lee Perry released one of his best albums, and in doing so revolutionised reggae once again. Blackboard Jungle is regarded by many as the first full-length dub album, although there's quite a lot of debate around it. Whether it was the first or not, it certainly defined this new subgenre and set the template for the many dub records that would follow. The instrumentals were stripped back to mostly just the drums and bass, with heavily affected bursts of the other instruments drifting in and out of the mix. The album was initially released on Perry's Upsetter Records label, with a limited run of just 300 copies being pressed, but it has been repressed, reissued and re-released numerous times over the years. For years, Perry had used various studios around Kingston to work on recordings. But in 1973, he finally built his own facility at the back of his family home. He named the new studio the Black Ark. The equipment in the studio was pretty low-end and low-spec, even for the time. The magic wasn't in the equipment he had, it was all about the way that he used it. He had a 4-track tape machine when a lot of other studios were running 8 or even 16 tracks. So he needed to be inventive about how he recorded. In his new studio, with full control over his recordings, Perry was more prolific than ever before, and the quality and creativity in his music was growing too. By the mid-1970s, Lee Scratch Perry was reaching the peak of his production powers. Between 1975 and 1977, he would record and release a sequence of albums that would define him as a producer. But first he had a few lineup issues to deal with. Carlton and Aston Barrett left the Upsetters to join the Wailers full-time, so replacements had to be drafted in. There was no shortage of quality to draw from. Leroy Horsemouth Wallace, best known as the star of the movie Rockers and the drummer for Burning Spear, and Sly Dunbar, one half of the legendary duo Sly and Robbie, were among the stellar musicians that played with Perry's house band over the next few years. In 1976, singer Mervyn Smith auditioned at the Black Ark for Lee Perry. He performed a song he'd written himself. Police and thieves in the street. Perry liked the song so much he recorded it straight away, and within a week the song was released under the name Junior Mervyn. Although written about the turbulent times in Jamaica, the track resonated with the ever-growing reggae audience in the UK. The song took on a prophetic quality when a few weeks after it was released, it became the soundtrack of the 1976 Notting Hill Carnival in London, as police clashed with some of the attendees.
When I drove in from Brixton, I couldn't believe it. This is not a Notting Hill Carnival, this is a police carnival, because it seemed like more police than anybody else.
Police and thieves in the street.
In anticipation of trouble, they'd come down and, kind of heavy-handedly. There was a massive police presence, which kind of put this mood over the carnival that year.
Police and thieves.
Fighting and looting went on well into the night, but even so, only a quarter of a mile away, the bands were still playing, and people were still enjoying themselves.
Among the rioters was Joe Strummer and Paul Simonon, better known as the punk band The Clash.
But in that summer of '76, which was very hot, there'd been some very heavy police pressure on the black community. We were there at the very first throw of the first brick.
And the next minute, there was like police everywhere. And they literally just charged.
All hell broke loose, and I mean hell.
Bernie's glasses went over there, and I was over here, and Joe was chucked upside down. And
this was one time where people kind of went, we've had enough, and we're going to say so now. And Police and Thieves was just ringing out all over the town. We decided to try and cut a version.
The following year they recorded their own version of Police and Thieves, and although both Junior Mervyn and Lee Scratch Perry initially disliked their recording, they eventually came to appreciate it.
By rights they should have said, "Ya heathen man, you ruined the works of Jah," but they were hip enough to realise that we'd, if you like, brought our own music to the party.
Later that year, Lee Perry produced the track Complete Control for The Clash, and the single became their first to break the top 30, peaking at number 28 in the charts. Also in 1976, Lee Scratch Perry began working on an album with Max Romeo. The two had worked together on the track Three Blind Mice for Max Romeo's previous album Revelation Time. And now the singer wanted Perry to produce an entire album with him. Among the songs they recorded was the timeless classic Chase the Devil.
Lucifer, son of the morning, I'm gonna chase you out of earth.
As sampled by The Prodigy in 1992. Their single Outer Space samples the second half of the chorus of Max Romeo's song. The single sold nearly 750,000 copies and is probably the most successful track the group released, right up until Firestarter in 1996. In 2003, Kanye West sampled the intro of Chase the Devil for the Jay-Z track Lucifer. Countless other tracks have sampled Chase the Devil. The result of the sessions with Max Romeo and Lee Scratch Perry was the album War in a Babylon. War in a Babylon is among the finest of Lee Scratch Perry's work. It's considered to be part of the Black Ark Holy Trinity, along with Junior Mervyn's Police and Thieves and Party Time by the Heptones. It wasn't just the cream of Jamaican artists that wanted to record with Perry at Black Ark. His reputation as a groundbreaking producer was spreading across the global music scene. In 1977, one of the biggest rock stars of all time, Paul McCartney, arrived in Jamaica to record 2 songs with his wife Linda, under the guidance of the eccentric Jamaican producer. A few years later, Lee Scratch Perry would come to McCartney's rescue when the ex-Beatle was caught at Narita Airport in Tokyo, Japan, with 7 ounces of ganja. Lee Perry sent a letter to the Japanese Minister of Justice saying that McCartney's intentions were positive and that 7 ounces of weed isn't really that much. It's not clear what impact the letter had, but McCartney was released without charge and deported, but his Japanese tour was cancelled. Scratch also continued his dub adventures, refining the template he set with Blackboard Jungle with the much more polished album Super Ape in 1976 and Return of the Super Ape in 1978. In 1977, Lee Perry started work on an album for the duo The Congos. The first thing Perry did was add one of his session singers and percussionist, Wattie Burnett, to the lineup to enhance the vocal harmonies, and he called in illustrious singers like the Meditations and Gregory Isaacs to sing backing vocals. The result was perhaps the greatest album to come out of the Black Ark, Heart of the Congos. The album has all the hallmarks of a Lee Scratch Perry classic. It's almost as if every trick and technique he knew was used on this album. Hypnotic dub effects swirl around the intense Rasta drumming, with the 3-part vocal harmony sitting perfectly on top. The finished album was presented to Island Records, who had put out the dub album Super 8 with great success. However, they decided to pass on the chance to put out the Congos album. It's reported that they turned it down in fear that such a strong spiritual record would overshadow Bob Marley, who was growing in popularity, but with a sound Island founder Chris Blackwell had diluted to make more acceptable to mainstream audiences. Without a deal in the UK, Heart of the Congos didn't have the success the group expected, and they fell out with Perry. Over the years, Black Ark had attracted all manner of people wanting to hang around the famous studio. By the time the Congos album had been completed, the amount of people occupying the grounds around Perry's home and studio had reached a peak. This drove Lee Perry to breaking point, and he grabbed a marker pen and scrawled cryptic messages on all the walls and surfaces of the studio, and weeks later the studio burned to the ground. Perry claimed he purposefully destroyed the studio to rid it of unclean spirits, and there were stories of local gangsters blackmailing him for a cut of his profits. With the Black Ark destroyed, Perry left Jamaica for England, and then later moved to Switzerland. With no studio, Lee Perry's releases became less frequent over the next few years. In the mid-1980s, he began working with British producers Adrian Sherwood and Mad Professor, and his career took on a new lease of life. In 1998, he featured on the Beastie Boys track, Dr. Lee PhD, taking Lee Perry the artist to a much wider audience. In 2003, he won the Grammy for Best Reggae Album for the album Jamaican E.T., and the following year was added to Rolling Stone's 100 Greatest Artists of All Time. Despite being in his late 60s, Perry showed no signs of slowing down and continued to tour the world performing and released more than 30 albums after Jamaican E.T. He died in 2021 at the age of 85 from an unspecified illness. His mark on reggae and music in general is indelible. His legacy will live on. If Bob Marley is the face of reggae music, then Lee Scratch Perry was the heart. Now, what do you think? Let me know in the comments, and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications to get all the latest videos.